Good morning. I'm Kevin Clements, Director of the Toda Peace Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this latest public conversation in our climate change and conflict series. We're very privileged today to have the Reverend James Bhagwan as our guest. James is the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, a role which he's held since 2018. In this role, he's been active in reviving PCC relationships, recruiting new partners, and increasing the organization's visibility, as well as introducing a 5-year strategic plan. He's an ordained minister of the Methodist Church in Fiji and held the role of Secretary for Communications and Overseas Mission with the Methodist Church between 2013 and 2017. He's got a master's degree in theology, majoring in Christian social ethics, and is a strong advocate for the reweaving of the ecological map as an issue of Pacific self-determination and a gift to the world. He's also played an extremely active role in a range of official and civil society discussions in relation to both mitigating and adapting to the negative effects of climate change. In his spare time, he is an active paddler in different kinds of canoes and boats, and this gives him a very holistic view of protecting the centrality of the oceans in discussions about climate change. So James, welcome to this public conversation. My colleague, Dr. Volker, who's leading the program, has also prepared questions and is joining us in this interview. Welcome, Volker. So let's move on to the first question. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal life and the formative influences on it and the journey that led you to the position of General Secretary of PCC?
That's a big question to begin with, Kevin, and it's, I guess, something that could warrant a whole segment on its own. But suffice to say that I come from a very strong Christian family, a very ecumenical family in many respects, and a family that was, I had an upbringing that taught me to live my faith in community. And I think really that is the starting point for all that I do. I was also fortunate to build a very strong relationship with the ocean as a child growing up. And that's something that I guess has come back in a very big way, particularly as a father raising my own children. And I use my life experiences to motivate me in my ministry and the work that I do. My journey to the Pacific Conference of Churches is really the journey of my church, the Methodist Church in Fiji, and their decision to nominate me for that particular role. And it's something that I feel very privileged, and also understand the quite large responsibility that comes with steering the canoe of this size, metaphorically speaking, of course, as someone who has the opportunity to steer canoes in our voyaging canoes, but recognize that it's nothing you do on your own. When you sail on a canoe, everyone has a responsibility and a role. And I'm also very fortunate to work with some very passionate people who feel very strongly about the work that they do, not just from an advocacy point of view, but as part of their faith. And so, the team here at PCC really is the ones that have been making the stride. They just usually put me in front of the microphone to speak, maybe because I speak, I have experience in doing so from my background in the media. But none of the issues that PCC engages in are not issues of my heart. I was raised by a feminist mother. I have feminist sisters, so the issue of gender equality is a personal issue for me. I have a wife who has, who is related by blood to Kiribati, and so the stories of what my in-laws in Kiribati go through is the reality that I face. And so I think being someone who has that understanding from a community perspective, from a family or an extended family perspective, it really shapes the urgency around a lot of the work that we need to engage in the Pacific.
Good. Okay.
Thank you. And can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your organization, PCC, so the membership and also the main areas of work of PCC?
Thank you. In 1961, church leaders came together in Malua to talk about how they, as the faith communities in the Pacific, would work together. How do they advance the mission of the gospel together? And the result was the establishment of the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Pacific Theological College. In 1966, the first PCC assembly took place in Lifu in Kanaki, known as New Caledonia. I think that really set the tone for the work around self-determination, which forms a very important part of PCC's work over the last 6 decades. PCC was a critical part of the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement from the 60s and 70s. We have, within the self-determination, and particularly the political self-determination perspective, been consistently working on the issues of decolonization for Kanaki and Maunganui. I also want to perhaps highlight that for the PCC, the engagement around West Papua is not something new. We had a representative from the Evangelical Church in Tana Papua at that meeting in 1961. So since the very early days, the West Papuan churches have been part of PCC, and we now have quite a number of those churches in our membership. And so we have grown since then from just a handful of churches to now 33 member churches and 10 national councils of churches, where we stand at today, 60 years later. And our work, as I mentioned, focuses on self-determination, but not just the political self-determination. We're also talking about economic self-determination, cultural self-determination, social self-determination as well. And within that space is where we engage on issues such as gender equality, where we talk about child protection, where we talk about youth engagement and empowerment as well. And then, of course, ecumenism is at the heart of all that we do. So that is probably the central pillar of our work. And then, very importantly, the work around ecological stewardship and climate justice, which is really where this conversation is heading. And that continues to be a key area that our churches want us to work on.
Great, and that leads very nicely on to the next question, which is about the 2009 Moana Declaration. And would you be able to sort of give us some background on how that started and why this is important to all of you?
Well, the 2009 Moana Declaration is not the first declaration by Pacific churches on climate change. The first declaration was made in 2004 when the World Council of Churches gathered Pacific church leaders in Kiribati, where they made, after their discussions and deliberations, the Osintai Declaration. Osintai, of course, is the Kiribati word for sunrise. And it's in that first statement that we see the call by Pacific churches to their sisters and brothers around the world, particularly in the polluting countries. We see the call to the churches in those countries to raise awareness on the issues. And of course, church leaders going even further back to even before the start of the Conference of Parties on climate change have been part of that discussion through the World Council of Churches. But 2009 is significant in that the Moana Declaration for the first time engaged in the conversation around climate-induced displacement and relocation. And from there, we start to have more and more conversations around the issues of non-economic loss and damage, the issues of migration and human security. And so that Moana Declaration was significant in respects to thinking ahead of the issues that our Pacific communities face when we come to the issue of climate change. And considering that in 2021 and 2022, we are now moving towards a Pacific climate change, migration, and human security framework by the UN agencies and others, you can see how far ahead the churches were in trying to discern what the issues are going to be for Pacific people. And so that, I think in that sense, it was very significant. It also reminds us that we need to continually be looking ahead to see where we can do our best work in terms of the prophetic work, which is advocacy and raising awareness of emerging issues, and the pastoral work on the current issues, and very practical ways in which we can support our communities.
PCC obviously is at the forefront of dealing with the challenges of climate change. But as we understand it, there are also differences in the approach to climate change among the churches. There are some churches who do not take the matter seriously or even deny the facts based on their understanding of the teaching of their churches. So how do you deal with these divergent voices, also with regard to non-PCC member churches? And is there also progress in this regard over the recent years?
Thank you. When the Ocean Tide Declaration was made in 2004, a response by some communities was known as rainbow theology, hence the rainbow behind me. And it goes back to the story where, you know, after the great flood in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, God puts the rainbow in the sky as a sign of his covenant to say that he will never again flood the earth. So the understanding from that is that God will never flood the earth. And so climate change, whatever's happening, God will look after God's people. Now, our response to that over the years, and you know, this is quite interesting because the response was and continues to be that it is not God that is causing climate change. Right? The understanding, and particularly the IPCC report in 2007, was very important to help us bring the science to this issue that this is human-induced climate change, not divine-induced climate change. It's not, you know, God raising the water to punish people or anything like that. And I first encountered this conversation with the church in Tuvalu, where a local pastor or a minister who was my colleague at theological school was sharing the challenges he had in trying to respond to this issue. And then we fast forward to 2019, where at the Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting in Tuvalu, one of the leaders of the church in Tuvalu, the Ecclesiano Tuvalu, in his morning devotion, goes on to address this issue of the rainbow theology himself, you know, saying that this is not God's work, and they've recognized that. So in that sense, we found the shift in that space, particularly among the mainline churches. We have to recognize that different churches are at different levels of maturity in terms of their existence, in terms of the theology that they understand and that they espouse. There are those who have a very strong end times perspective. And so for them, it is about, this is the end of the world. This has to happen so that Jesus can come and create a new heaven and a new earth. There's some very literal interpretations of the Bible in that regard. But again, we come back to the role of the church in how do we support the communities, particularly those who are experiencing climate change, and how do we share their stories. And in that sense, PCC recognizes that there are two areas that we need to work on. The one, as I mentioned earlier, is around the non-economic loss and damage, the spiritual, psychosocial impacts of loss of land and what that means for Pacific communities, what loss of land means for Pacific people who are intrinsically connected to their land and to their ocean, and what that means to be uprooted and taken to another place. So trying to engage theologically in that space, but also trying to address what theological and pastoral support we can give around the issue of resilience for those who say, this is the land to which we will stand and fight. And how does God support us in that fight? So these are some of the areas that we continue to engage in. I think even to this day, the conversation around relocation and or displacement and relocation is one that many communities struggle to have, particularly many countries struggle to have, when it comes to countries themselves having to relocate, or whole communities relocating, as opposed to internal displacement and relocation, where people are moving from one piece of land on their island to another piece of land that they may already belong to.
That's also an interesting kind of way of thinking about the differences between secular and religious approaches to climate change in the Pacific. I mean, why do you feel that the religious orientation is important in this regard, and how does it complement the secular understanding of climate change?
Well, Kevin, I think there was a really interesting article by Professor Patrick Nunn who talks about this, and the name of the article was "Sidelining God While Secular Climate Adaptation Projects Are Failing in the Pacific." But he articulates what many of us have been saying for a long time, is the recognition that Pacific people have a certain worldview. It's a very spiritual worldview. And that spiritual worldview is deeply influenced by their indigenous culture and sense of connection with land, with the environment, with the ocean, and also with their Christian faith. We're in a region where 70 to 80% of the region professes Christianity, and where you may not find a police station in some communities or a health center, you will find at least one church. So we recognize that faith leaders have an important role to play in a community that professes to be people of faith, but particularly of a particular type of faith, Christianity. And so recognizing that this worldview speaks to the, should I say, maybe one part of the brain, but I would like to say it speaks to the heart, while the more secular approaches speak to the head. And there is a need to ensure that we have an integration of both. So this is where we like to see strong partnerships between secular organizations and faith-based organizations. And I think this is also why we see a lot of collaboration in this space in particular between faith communities and civil society.
The question that is sort of a bit of a follow-up to that would be around using the metaphor of weaving the mat or reweaving the ecological map. So can you sort of give us some understanding of what that means in terms of your approaches to the challenges of climate change, and why is that metaphor so important to you?
Well, aside from the obvious imagery of weaving and of mats and of baskets, and of sails, because even our sails are woven out of mats, much bigger and heavier mats, but still nevertheless. The recognition that something is very wrong in our oikos, our household, and that things need to change. And over the since 2017, 18. The Pacific Theological College, the University of the South Pacific Oceania Center, the Pacific Conference of Churches, and others involved in the cultural space, the theological space, the conservation and environmental space, began to sit together and talk about what is the context and what needs to change. And this resonates with a lot of the global voices that we are hearing around the fact that something needs to change in our world in order for us to move away from the climate crisis. If business as usual continues, the climate crisis will only worsen and it's doomed for the whole planet. But how do we change? And what needs to be changed is not really being articulated. So in this understanding and in the context of unsustainable development practices in the region, within the Pacific, of highly extractive industries, both of land and now in sea, the people working who developed the model and began this work around reweaving the ecological map, use the metaphor of the mat because of the work that goes into it, that there are strands, and each of those strands is a narrative. So how do we deal with those narratives? How do we deal with those issues? And recognizing that when we sit on the mat creates community, it creates a sense of home and a sense of place. The mat is woven into a basket, which represents our hospitality and reciprocity, which is part of our Pacific way. And the mat also goes into a sail, which talks about our journey to self-determination, our journey as community. But when the mat gets damaged, we don't throw the mats away. We find strands that can fix the mat. And we take out some of those damaged strands and we put in new strands. And so in the same way, the people who really came up with the thinking around the reweaving the ecological map, and they brought in the concept of recognizing that there was a time when everything was good. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the line, things started to go wrong. The wrong strands got introduced into our weaving. And so we open up the mat to that part where things went from being good to unsustainable. And we look at those strands that have been added since then, and what are those toxic strands? What needs to be taken out and what needs to be brought back in? And a lot of that has to do with ensuring that there is, for example, free, prior, and informed consent around development. There is a recognition that Pacific people or indigenous people value what people would term natural resources very differently. That there is a service that the environment or natural resources provide to the environment, even when they're still in the ground. That we're not talking about the market value, we're talking about the ecological value that they provide. And particularly that Pacific people have agency. And I think that's something that's been neglected for so long. The urgency, the agency around how we describe or how we engage on the kind of development that we would like to see. And ultimately that the most important indicator for the development for that in our context as Pacific people is not economic development, but development that results in the well-being of community, the well-being of the human community, but also the well-being of the environment. And to shift that kind of conversation that we're having on a global space, when people are saying, what's the alternative? When we listen to people like, the young woman, Greta Thunberg, and others who for many years who have been articulating these shifts that need to be made. And this is something that I strongly believe is a gift that the Pacific, if we can articulate it well to the world, could be quite significant in addressing the climate crisis.
You just also mentioned this term oikos, household. So what does this concept of the oikos, the household, contribute to engaging with the challenges of climate change?
The Greek word oikos refers to the household. And for the Pacific Conference of Churches and for all those involved in the ecumenical movement, that's also where we get the word oikumene, ecumenism, which talks about the relationship in the inhabited earth, our relationship. So, ecumenism in that sense is not just about the relationship between Christians, it's also the relationship between Christians and non-Christians, between human beings and the environment. But from oikos, we also get oikos logos, which is ecology, and oikos nomos, which is economics, the management of the household. So we need to recognize that these concepts coming from the same root word have are intrinsically connected. But what we've seen in the past is that economics is taken away and runs on its own and placed above the ecological situation. So placed above ecology, and also placed above our relationship with one another. And so that's why you have so much conflict related around economics. That's why you have so much environmental degradation placed as a result of profit being placed ahead. And so if we're able to re-engage in this kind of understanding, and that comes back to our reweaving the ecological map, which is our specific articulation of the reweaving of this sacred thread that binds ecology, economics, and our relationship with one another and the natural world.
One of the interesting things about having a distinctively religious approach to this is that you carve out a sphere for yourself which has to do with religious organizations and institutions. How do you then translate your own religious concerns on these issues in relation to governments and civil society organizations?
I think what you've said is very important to recognize. It's the language that we speak. We are talking about the same issues, and we are proposing responses to those issues also, but it's in our faith language. And it's recognizing that for the majority in the Pacific, members of government are also members of faith communities, as are members of civil society. And so, firstly, the church is the largest NGO in any Pacific Island country. It's probably the oldest, bringing in education, healthcare, social welfare, and many other things which today governments run as part of their role of looking after a nation or managing a nation. And so we have that history. Some of it is not always bright. There have been lessons we've learned along the way, particularly with the impact of colonialism. But by and large, the impact of the work of the churches is quite significant. So engaging that, recognizing that Pacific people, whether they're civil society, whether they're government, if not have the same worldview, but then at least respect and understand that worldview. But also that what we're talking about is not different from what the scientists are talking about. We're speaking the same language. And here I refer to the Faith and Science statement that was put out on the 4th of October last year, where many of us faith leaders engaged with scientists, climate scientists for about 4 or 5 months, discussing and speaking to each other, and then crafting a statement which was then presented to the incoming COP26 presidency of the United Kingdom. And so recognizing that faith and science can speak together on this issue, recognizing that faith communities and civil society and government can work together on these issues. And so our role in that space is one of advocacy, the prophetic voice, again, speaking in this space, in this language, on behalf of our constituency, our people, our communities of faith. It's providing the pastoral support also, because this is hard work. It's often painful work for those who go out to fight for justice in the climate change conversations, whether it's civil society or governments involved in negotiations at the UNFCCC during the COP meetings, and to be there and be part of that process. And so we're able to, as faith communities, really fit in across the board to the various communities that we engage in.
And as I understand it, PCC works on these issues of climate change at different levels, from the local to the international. So can you maybe give some examples of your work at the local level in Fiji or other Pacific Island countries?
I think the pastoral work that we do in our local communities is quite key to our engagement in the advocacy space. We're engaging with local communities who are experiencing the impacts of climate change. Our first role is to help them understand that they're not being punished for anything that they have done. It's not God punishing them for their sins, which is easy to understand when it says, why is this happening to me? If you're a person of faith and you've lived a good life, you don't know why things are going wrong. And, you know, considering that out of the 1.4% of carbon emissions that the Pacific Island Forum countries, you know, contribute to global warming and to climate change, 1.3 of that percent is Australia, and then 0 point something New Zealand, and then we're at that, you know, not even the bit that you cut off on the fingernail when it comes to carbon emissions. But, you know, we have to explain and guide our communities in these questions of, how do I live? What's the next step that I take? And this is where faith communities can play both a pastoral role and a practical role. So whether it's been with communities in Kiribati, whether it's been with communities here in Fiji, in 2015, when the first indigenous community of Wurundjeri was going through a relocation process, PCC engaged with the Methodist Church in Fiji, one of our member churches here, to provide the pastoral accompaniment. In 2020, in preparation for COP26, you know, we went to the village of Narikoso in the Kandavu group of islands to look and engage with the community there and listen to them and ask questions of what support they need and try and figure out some of those issues that they're facing. It's that engagement that drives our regional and global advocacy work. It's that engagement that you know, ensures that we don't just say, we'll take what we can get on the issue of climate change. And you know, it's also that engagement which challenges us to work with our member churches to engage as strongly as possible on the issue of climate justice.
Which leads on to the second question. I mean, you're working very closely at that local and national level. Can you give us some indication of how you work with groups like the Pacific Island Forum and other regional organizations in the Pacific? Do you observe their meetings? Do you have observer status? How do you work at that level?
With the Pacific Islands Forum, we are part of the non-state actors engagement program. And so we don't have a formal observer status at the forum, but we have an engagement program through which we're able to engage with Pacific Island leaders during their leaders meetings. So every leaders meetings, we now have a non-state actor dialogue. Usually it's civil society and then private sector, or maybe this year it will be combined because it's a short time frame for the meeting. So we have those formal engagement processes. There are also informal spaces. So for example, a colleague from the Pacific Network on Globalization and myself were part of the civil society. We were the civil society leads in the informal working group on the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which is about to be taken to the Pacific Island leaders at their meeting this year. And so there are spaces in which we can engage, particularly with civil society. We work very closely with civil society. We have engagements and our members. We are part of the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network. We are part of the Pacific Regional NGO Alliance, where we work with the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs and other regional civil society groups. And there is a lot of formal and informal collaboration. And this is, I think, the beautiful thing about the Pacific. Maybe because we are vulnerable, because we are affected by climate change, we are all able to work together with a common purpose. Sometimes what we're asking for from civil society and faith communities is more than what our governments are asking for. But they work within the realm of bilateral relations and multilateral relations. We come from a different perspective, particularly from the churches, coming from a very strong justice perspective and responding to what we hear from the communities on the ground, as do the other civil society communities. And so there's a lot of collaboration in that space. And we understand that when we go to, for example, something like a COP meeting, COP 26, for example, we are going as the Pacific. Everybody has their different roles to play. Everybody has different areas of access in which they can get to. The government delegation are in the negotiations, civil society is outside putting on pressure, and faith communities, we're in between, all of it. Sometimes a bit stretched, but we're there to support the leaders and provide that pastoral support and solidarity, and then go and advocate outside with the civil society groups. And so I think in that regard, the Pacific is particularly strong when we go to these meetings, because we go with a very common agenda from which we build in our different spaces.
Yeah, so you mentioned COP, and that's the international level that PCC is working at. So what were your experiences in Glasgow last year?
I was, I wasn't sure whether it was even worth going. I'll be honest. We see a lot of rhetoric. There was a lot of almost disclaimers by the British Prime Minister that it wouldn't be an effective meeting, that not much would come out of it. And even the way that the meetings were designed by the presidency, the United Kingdom, was quite challenging, because they had the leaders gathering beforehand, before negotiations even started. So it was quite a challenge to deliver something meaningful and worthwhile at the end. But I also found a recognition of the way in which we can support one another. And so, providing in particular, not just the advocacy work in terms of being with the climate warriors and other civil societies, and being strong in the advocacy to the polluting countries, particularly our neighbor, Australia, but also in supporting negotiators, supporting leaders in the space in which they engaged, and working with the global faith community. And I had the responsibility, I guess the privilege in many ways, to present a statement on behalf of faith communities in the plenary towards the end of the COP meeting. So, in some ways, it's a step forward. I think some of the engagements, particularly with the Scottish First Minister, who represents the second level of engagement, the non-state countries, or what we call it's almost like a track 2 engagement, but represents states and provinces within countries and cities. That was a very important conversation, because we were talking about how do we get climate financing directly to communities, and that's an important thing too, so that these big mechanisms don't get in the way of communities who need the money urgently getting it, and not being perhaps sometimes diverted by governments if they're not able to, or not willing to share that money that they receive, even if they're able to get it. What I am always concerned about is the circus that takes place at the COPs. This 26 was my third COP. I was at COP 23 and COP 25. And sometimes the events around the COP meetings can be a distraction for those who don't really know what to experience. And I was there watching some young activists coming into the space for the first time, and seeing them, seeing Barack Obama going to speak, everybody rushing because he's a celebrity, but not realizing that while all of that circus is happening, the negotiators are struggling in the meeting rooms to try and make deals around certain articles and areas of negotiation. I think last year was particularly difficult because of because of COVID. Our Pacific delegations were outnumbered and outgunned by lobbyists. and it was quite difficult for our teams to do the negotiations. And so I really hope that this year, as we move forward, there's a lot more a strong representation by the Pacific, and I hope that COVID and other pandemics notwithstanding, we can get some serious work done.
Okay, so this would lead then to the question how you prepare for the next COP, which is going to take place in Egypt later this year.
Our experience from last year was perhaps we left things a little bit too late. And that can be understood because with COVID, nobody knew if they were going. We didn't know if we could get out of the country. We didn't know what the processes would be. But I think one of the things that we discussed, and I can see that already within the faith and science working group of religious leaders who want to continue the conversation after the meetings, after the faith and science statement was delivered, and trying to say, how do we transition over? And I think in particular, the United Kingdom in its COP presidency is trying to make a very good transition as well. How do we continue some of those conversations? But that's important for us here in the Pacific. How do we maintain those conversations from COP26 to COP27? Usually we start to see things ramping up about August, September, as we move into October, and the framing of statements and that sort of thing. But what we've tried to do early on this year is actually start to build the networks or strengthen the networks, strengthen the relationships, and be more strategic in the issues that we want to engage in, and recognizing, what are the things that are perhaps less effective, and while it might make for good television and good media, may not be the strategic in terms of being effective in the negotiations.
In that regard, can we sort of focus a little bit of attention about the issue you put on the table a bit earlier around loss and damage, and why that's a key issue for Pacific Islanders, and what does it comprise at the moment? But more importantly, I guess, what are you thinking of doing in relation to reparations for loss and damage?
Absolutely, that's the issue. At the end of the day, we're talking about getting the polluting countries to acknowledging, and when we talk about the loss and damage, this becomes a very key issue. There's a little bit of movement as a result of last year about process, but it's very easy for that process to stall in terms of the engagement around loss and damage. There's a lot of focus on economic loss and damage. So the impact of climate change on a country in terms of economics, in terms of development, in terms of, as we would perhaps like to put it, the well-being in the community. And that can be quantified by damage, by the costs of replacing things, by loss of income. But what we're talking about also is the non-economic loss and damage, which I mentioned earlier, the psychosocial, the spiritual, the processes that need to be implemented, which all will have a cost. You need to train people to pastorally accompany those going through displacement and relocation. You need to develop good protocols around relocation that include indigenous communities, that include spiritual and cultural protocols, and that find a way for those communities who are being basically uprooted to plant their roots in a new place and flourish as a community, as their community. And so these are just some of the aspects of the non-economic loss and damage that will require, support as we move forward.
Yeah, now you already talked about climate change induced displacement and relocation and the challenges associated with that for Pacific communities. And what I found really interesting is that you talk about the need for a shift from the exile to the exodus discourse in this field. Can you elaborate on that? because as you said before, it's so difficult for Pacific Islanders to accept the need to move because of the close connection to the land and to the ocean where they come from.
I think it's also important to recognize that we are, even as indigenous people with strong connections to land and sea and strong connections to place, I think that is the key thing, that we're also migrant people. The bulk of Pacific Islanders voyaged into the Pacific. They came in various waves by canoes reading the stars on giant ocean-going vessels long before these notions of travel were ever thought of in Europe and elsewhere. And so it's our ability to, again, with that reweaving, to really look at the long history of our people, to recognize that we are people who move from place to place. We in the past, we sailed from island to island to exchange produce, to exchange relationships, to exchange science and knowledge. And so we can do so again. And so it's recognizing that leaving your home does not have to be a thing where your life is over, that we can move from that context of disconnection to a new home and a new place. And really that is about finding the mechanisms, both in terms of social mechanisms, cultural mechanisms, spiritual mechanisms, and in terms of policy and legislation support for that type of relocation and that flourishing to take place. There's a lot of biblical support that we can give, or theological support about communities moving from place to place and flourishing in those new places. But the concept of exile really is about solidarity and resonating with how the people are feeling now. And then our role and our task is to work with them to transform that feeling of exile, of being dislocated and disconnected, into one of mobility and hopefully setting down their roots in a new land. We use cultural protocol as a way of saying they take their roots in this soil, which is their culture, and they're able to put that even with that soil until their roots can, strengthen and connect to the new soil in which they find themselves. So I think that really is something that we have been looking at, and in the work around the Pacific climate change, mobility, and human security framework, particularly for those of us who are involved in the technical advisory group, that's been an area in which we've tried to really focus on. We know that people don't want to leave, and we have communities, where people say we don't have anywhere to go, we don't know what that means. But it's saying if that has to happen, and he would say, God forbid that has to happen, then we have already the framework. And in already having the framework, we're able to say, ensure the dignity of those communities so that they're not going to another place and becoming second or third class citizens or stateless people. They still have a stake in the land that they've left and in the land that they now call home. So it's that work. It's still a long way to go, but at least we're having those conversations. And I think those are the things that it's important for us to engage and think about.
There's a sort of final question here, which picks up on what you've just been talking about. Has to do with the kind of whole role of the Pacific diaspora communities and PCC's work in relation to those communities, because they're a kind of key part of what you've just been talking about. And then what would you expect from recipient communities and societies in New Zealand or Australia, whatever, if Pacific Islands peoples are forced to relocate to them?
Yes, I mean, as Volker noted, I was recently in Australia, and I had some very good conversations with the Pacific diaspora in between events and speaking engagements. And one of the things that we need to do first and foremost is recognize the immense contribution that the Pacific diaspora makes to their homelands, their home islands, and to support those who come to the new place, whether it is migrant labor, whether it is those who are relocating because of, whether it's security issues in terms of conflict, whether it's climate induced, whatever it is, that it's the diaspora that provide that first welcome and engagement. And so this is where we talk about the spirituality of hospitality, that there needs to be that spirituality of hospitality. And particularly in the context of Australia and New Zealand, which are the closest sort of rather big countries that our people may find themselves going to. And here I acknowledge that Auckland is the largest Pacific Island city, has the largest Pacific Island population. And so, recognizing those facts or those factors, there is an important part of this, and this is what PCC is trying to engage in Australia and in New Zealand, to engage with our indigenous communities. So the Pacific Diaspora and the indigenous communities, the First Peoples of Australia and our Maori sisters and brothers in this process. And so in that space, because that talks about receiving communities and receiving countries, we need to ensure that our Pacific communities and our indigenous communities have the agency to engage in these processes in their own countries. Now, it's very interesting to see, for example, Australia, the foreign minister talking about having an indigenous focus on foreign policy. Now, will this indigenous focus on foreign policy also engage on the climate justice matter? Will that engage on the issue of migrant labor, on climate-induced displacement and relocation? Or is it just having an indigenous person in the team to say we have an indigenous person? So it's moving away from those tokenistic aspects and attitudes to real engagement. And one of the key areas for the PCC in the next few years, which is part of our strategic plan, it was an outcome from our assembly in 2018, which was in Auckland, specifically to acknowledge the diaspora community in Auckland, is to strengthen those relationships and the engagement between Pacific churches, Pacific communities, and their diaspora and the indigenous communities in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm very happy to see that we now have, as of I think 2020, the Maori Council of Churches as a member of the PCC. We have the Uniting Church in Australia as a member of PCC, but through its United Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. So the indigenous people are the conduit for that relationship. And now the work is to, now that we're through COVID pretty much, to build on that and strengthen those relationships to ensure that there is agency in the conversations around climate justice and relocation.
James, we're at the end of our hour. On behalf of the Toda Peace Institute and Volker and everybody watching this, I'd just like to thank you for your forthright responses to our questions and for giving us some indication of the specific challenges facing religious leaders such as yourself as you negotiate issues around justice and ecology, sustainability and climate change. So thank you for your contribution to this discussion and all the best for your future work in all of these different areas. You have many, many tasks on your plate as you can see, and I think you've given us a good illustration of how you're beginning to grapple with those within a kind of spiritual theological context. So thanks very much.